Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Ideas and Inspiration, an exploration of creativity presented by Abby Holmes. My name is Mallory Misnarsic and I'm the project manager here at Harmon. Just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during this webinar. However, there is a Q&A function where you can submit questions to the presenter and she'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and a link will be made available a few days after this presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. We encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series on pro.harmon.com, as well as visiting Harmon Professional Training to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Abby Holmes, the presenter for today's webinar. Abby is a multidisciplinary artist known for innovative cutting-edge design in lighting, video, and production. Her work spans across iconic projects in concerts, installations, events, TV, and film for such clients as the High Roller Las Vegas Observation Wheel, the Wall in Berlin, Disney, Cher, Talking Heads, and many more. And now I'll pass it over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Hi, everyone, and thank you to Martin so much for having me participate in this webinar. It's a really great thing that they're putting this work and effort in making this really interesting group of presentations available, and I think it's a nice thing to help build our community, especially when it's so much harder for all of us to see each other. And thank you all for joining. When Martin approached me about doing a webinar session, Brad Schiller suggested that I might talk about my creative process and my inspiration. And I think he was probably picturing me talking about a specific project I had worked on, what the details of that project were, what obstacles, practical, budgetary difficulties influenced the choices I made, and how I broke all those elements down into creating a lighting design. I'm mostly not going to do that at all. Actually, I'm not going to do that, or even really talk about my own work today. I am really interested in the idea of what makes someone want to do work creatively, where that drive comes from, what gives them the momentum to keep pushing and doing this work. So I thought we might take a look at some ideas about creative drive and the creative process, and then also look at aspects of some of the very specific elements specific to creating in lighting design, and how we can use them creatively and the part that they play in our creative approaches to our work. Oh, I'm just gonna, sorry guys. I switched mouse hands. I want to thank everybody who sent in questions ahead of time. Those were really interesting and helpful to me. A lot of them were things that I was already thinking about, and some of them pushed me to look a little bit differently. And one of the notes mentioned the idea of what we start with, what we bring with us. And I had thought about this a lot too. How much does our personal background or our experience change or determine how we think creatively? Like many of the subjects we're going to touch on today, we could probably spend the whole session on this. What do we bring of ourselves and experiences, and how does that change our work? I think it's obvious that our individual point of view affects our creative work. And we form our ideas through what we've been exposed to, what we've had the opportunity to see, and what we've experienced. We're influenced by where we grew up and what that showed us, by where we have lived or been lucky enough to travel and what that's allowed us to see. And we're influenced by people that we've spent time with, sometimes working, sometimes not. And this session itself is an exploration of ideas, thoughts, and questions that I put together inherently from my point of view. And it partly reflects a look at some of the areas I might think to explore and to consider when I'm working on creative approaches. So in deference to the question being sent ahead, and because it seems appropriate, I'm just going to start by giving a really brief look at my background and how that might have changed how I do work creatively. This is a picture of my mother. She was a very cutting-edge contemporary dancer. So I grew up seeing so much modern dance, lots of dance lighting, a lot of theater, some of it really experimental. My father was a mathematician, very different, but I think still so relevant to what happens in lighting, particularly. There's so much underlying science in lighting. And I think there is something in the way that mathematics senses relationships between numbers, almost spatially. And I think that resonates very strongly in lighting. I mean, maybe quite concretely in thinking about how we deal with programming or use of automated lights and in the manipulation of video, but also just much more esoterically in the relationship and the resonance between beams of light and color and in composition. In university, my studies, I was an art major. So though I took theater and other theater lighting classes, my overall viewpoint and main focus entering work in this field was not out of a theater background specifically. I was very directed by art and by music. And we're going to look at a lot of art as examples for some of what we'll talk about today. When I stood back and looked at that collection of information and tried to see what would my takeaway be from that, you know, those mediums, dance, music, art, they convey emotion and they have meaning, but they are not usually thought of as literal storytelling mediums. Even mathematics is considered one of the more theoretical and esoteric of the sciences, not a hard science per se. So all these mediums, they push experience and emotion to the viewer in abstract ways. And that's something that we're going to come back to and touch on further. I am going to very intentionally do most of the exploration today using examples from creative mediums other than lighting. Partly because they're just really good examples of the questions we might want to think about, but partly because it might allow us some objectivity outside our relationship with our own work. So it's not so much to avoid baggage, it's more to avoid attaching context very strongly and having that make it difficult to think about other things. So you might not intend to, but your subjective thoughts might be following all the information that you'd associate with any case that we were looking at. You might be thinking, this is a certain kind of project. It has a history, its relationship to projects before and after it. Maybe it has a certain kind of aesthetic. This kind of performer would be expected to have this kind of presentation. There may be looks that are created or tools that are used that you would expect to see in that performance. And you're going to identify and recognize them right when you look at them. You might know somebody who worked on this project, and then you're going to be fitting it in your head into other work that they've done, anything you might know about the process of that project or other projects like it, and breaking down your knowledge of the equipment that they used, and so on and so on and so on. And that can be a lot of noise. And my thought was that it might make it harder to just break out these visual and creative elements and for once just think about them for their own sake in a wide-ranging kind of way and think about what they might add to creative work and how we might use them. There's so much to think about in this topic. And of course, we're not going to get through everything in one webinar. And there are so many small elements that combine to reach a result in lighting design, and some of them really specific to lighting design. And I think it's part of what makes it such an interesting field. And there would be a ton of interesting elements specific to lighting worth exploring. Specifics like the relationship of art with science in a field that uses technology to realize its design. And it's so deeply a product of physics. When we use technology and equipment to create, we have set up a form where you first design a framework made out of equipment, design in and of itself, and then use it to make the art. And working with the equipment, selection of gear, the use of the gear, there's a sort of two-step process of securing and placing equipment, and then creating in itself, this second phase of creating visuals is absolutely a part of the process of lighting. And that technology and that process is so inherent to most of what we do. I think in lighting design, there's virtually always some elements or huge elements of collaboration. There's collaboration between creative disciplines amongst team members on a project. And we'll try to look at a little bit of that at the end today if we get enough time. It's not true for all lighting design, but virtually all of it is work which is done for a viewer. So the piece you are creating is always in some level being made in the idea of response from an audience, often a live performance. So all of these contribute to what we do creatively and how that changes the work that we do. I'm going to show a lot of pictures today because we're visual people. And it probably could have still been more, but there's only so much time. So, and verbally, I'm going to quote often and heavily from many, many art reviews and art sites. I will try to get those attributions in when I can, and I apologize in advance if I miss any of them. Let me just say that my intent here today is not to try to answer anything, and I'm not looking for us to solve anything. I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and the intent is more to raise some different ways of thinking about what we do, and maybe some of those, for some of you, will spark an idea in your head or crack open a door to thinking or working in a different way. Some of the work that we'll look at, I've chosen because it illustrates these ideas that I want to explore really well. And obviously, many of these artists I find personally intriguing, inspiring, exciting, and looking at and thinking about their work makes me want to go and do something creative myself. So I'd like to start with just thinking about the drive to create. I'm always so curious about this. What makes somebody driven to do creative work? You know, to feel just utterly compelled to be an artist, a lighting designer, a poet, you know, rather than perhaps a fantastically effective and productive lawyer or scientist or a teacher or farmer, or so many other choices where someone could make that choice and have a fully satisfying, fulfilling life that contributes to society. And for the people who do have this drive to create, for so many, it's something they truly need to do to feel at one with themselves. I think we probably all know people in both categories. People for whom it's deeply fundamental to create in some way, and others who simply don't think that way and maybe don't understand it completely when they see it in others. Whoops, I am somehow going backwards and I apologize. Okay. Got my setup done a little differently today, folks, so I apologize if I get a little caught up in my tech. Okay, I don't know how many of you might have ever heard about or had the opportunity to visit a museum called the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore. It's amazing. if you ever have the opportunity, I strongly recommend checking it out. This is the official National Museum for Self-Taught Intuitive Artistry. So what does that mean? They describe their mission and their artists this way, and I quote, "Visionary art, as defined for the purposes of the American Visionary Art Museum, refers to art produced by self-taught individuals, usually without formal training, whose works arise from an innate personal vision that revels foremost in the creative act itself." So this is a museum dedicated to the preservation and exhibition of outsider art. It's a fantastic museum, all work of artists with no formal training. These artists might have been farmers, housewives, mechanics, the disabled, homeless. The museum does not usually look for those who have learned a practice in a colloquial term is at the knee, a craft or a tradition that's passed on, an artisan tradition such as native weaving. Those are beautiful crafts, but not what they're interested in. These are mostly artists that have found some self-drive to create and some inherent need to make creative work. Some of the artists had religious visions. Some had suffered personal trauma or mental health issues. And many, but not all of the artists included are from marginalized communities. But as a group, as individuals, they felt driven to create, often with no experience of art making to draw from, nothing in their family, nothing in their surroundings, nothing in their immediate experience, which would suggest the making of art as a pastime or a calling. In some cases, we can start to see some of what's speaking to those who have religious epiphanies, who have these experiences. They might be reflecting that in their art. But in many cases, the pieces are much more personal than that. If you do get the opportunity to go to this museum, I'm just going to note that they have a wide collection and the pieces in the building are changing pretty frequently. So you may not see these pieces I'm going to show today or the ones I saw when I was able to visit. Some of these pieces look like a kind of art we understand or could relate to as we usually look at what a curated or considered piece of art would be. And some, maybe the piece of the ship made out of matchsticks, maybe we could start to understand them as a hobby. We could look at the art inspired by religious convictions or visions and understand that there might be a long history of this. But even in these maybe more accessible works, the artists here are working outside any conventional training. They aren't specifically aware of the history of art or its movements. They're not looking to the work of someone who preceded them or their contemporaries. They're making their aesthetic choices purely from personal instinct. So when you look at these works, throughout these works, you know that these artists, they're not comparing their work to others or responding to other art. And they're not framing this work with the work of other people in mind, not comparing it to other work. Again, the work's deeply personal. It comes from a conversation they're having within themselves, their response to the world, their way of processing the world. And this is why the mission statement of the museum talks about work reflecting art, which has more to do with the very process and experience of creating rather than the finished work as a goal. Whatever drives these artists to create, whatever they're working through, it's realized in the very action of creation. That's what their driving force is. Just gonna pause to say that while there's really serious issues in the museum is a ton of fun, really fun. They have a kinetic sculpture race once a year that you can see in this image. And that piece is in the museum next to a life-size sculpture of Divine from the John Waters movie. So it's a super interesting place to go. You know, another thing that is very interesting thinking about this set of artists is how their art relates to a viewer. The work of these artists, in many cases, is not made with the intent of it being viewed by someone else. There was work when I visited the museum that I was really moved by. It was made by a man who had, I don't remember what his job and his main part of his life was. It was not a creative job, a very everyday job. And when he retired, in his retirement, you know, he would go to the basement every day of the modest house that he lived in. And his family didn't really think a lot about what he was doing down there. Maybe he was tinkering or he had his stuff, but he seemed content, and they really left it alone. And when this man passed away, there were over 90 paintings in the basement. So he had been going down and making creative work every single day and not telling anyone about it, making it entirely for the sake of making it, for what that meant to him. I just find that very, very interesting, this experience of the creative act of creating as the goal in itself. I think one thing that's interesting about it is that it means the artist in that moment is not self-checking or self-editing with the thoughts of how somebody else will see it, something that I think is very natural to do when we work professionally. And it's quite different from how we work in lighting design to be thinking about this art that is not made specifically for an external person's experience, but made for your own. When we talk about lighting, video, and stage design, we are speaking of mediums which exist where people will see them, whether that be live performance, installation, other uses. At least I don't know of anyone making lighting design in their basement that no one is seeing. Although I guess if no one's seeing it, I wouldn't know. But that made me think about the fact that we do work in a medium where people do experience what we create. So why do we want people to see what we are making? Is it for affirmation, for someone to tell us that our work is good, or is it in whole or in part made really for the audience? And if that's the case, how does that awareness of who the viewer is going to be change what we're going to create? Is there a viewer that we're maybe unconsciously talking to in our heads the whole time we're making something? And if that's true, how does their existence in our head change what we're making? And I find in most of the projects we do as lighting, there are so many voices. There's a client, there's our peers, there's collaborators, there's the audience. That's a lot of input. And again, you could have a whole other session about how people handle that differently, how much that is something that they thrive on, that becomes part of the work, that is something they push back on to hold on to their very strong vision. But I think that for sure it has an effect. I'm going to take a look at some individual creative works to look at some of the different ways artists are using their own creative mediums to explore and to extend their worlds. And maybe find some interesting ways that their creative drive is realized in their worlds. We're going to look at creators who have taken the field they work in and just pushed way past what the norms or what we expect out of that field is going to be. So for these people, the medium they work in is truly just a starting point. And in that case, when there's a deeper exploration of a particular avenue of creativity or a creative viewpoint, then I am curious about what drives that artist as well. is pushing past the normal intent of this medium part of the point of the work? Is that done with intentionality to show they have crossed that line? Or are they simply ignoring what's conventional, under the process and the drive of their own creative exploration is just taking them way past where someone else might go? We're gonna start looking at two fashion designers, starting with the designer Rick Owens. Fashion shows have long featured show-stopping pieces that defy what we would think of as ordinary wear. But I think there's some creative people working in fashion design that have gone way past that in their work, and Rick Owens is one of them. While making his work clearly for an audience, you nonetheless retain the feeling that his work is entirely his own creative exploration. And it feels like a deeply personal and deep exploration with clothing as the medium. It's rendered tangible through shapes, volumes, contemporary materials, and also things that are deliberately misaligned and deconstructed. And this is a quote from Rick Owens. He says, "The clothes I make are my autobiography. They are the calm elegance I want to get to and the damage I've done on the way. They're an expression of tenderness and of raging ego. They are an adolescent idealization and its inevitable defeat." Which I think, could not state more clearly that he is working through his own issues in this process that he's exploring. And another quote, "I'm hesitant to define what I do as art. I think in 3 dimensions, so this has a lot to do with the construction and less with the styling. Let's say it's much more similar to sculpture, but I don't want to call it art." And I think you really see that in his work. He's playing with form and shape. These things are clothes and they're on a human body, but not in the way that we would ordinarily think of someone just making a fashionable piece of clothing. And I think you see that they come from his aesthetic. You can see the development and this thread that goes through this exploration. And as Rick Owens' work developed, you also start to see reflected or acknowledged inclusion of outside issues, some partly specific to fashion and some that certainly resonate more wildly than that. And looking at them, you can start to answer this sort of question that people have asked about fashion. If they're not taking it seriously, when has fashion been able to make a difference? I think we see a lot of it in the work of Rick Owens. There's been a dialogue from the beginning, maybe of what is ugly and what is beautiful, and how tenuous that line is. Questions about how we perceive the body. There is, throughout his work, a sense of the gender neutral, a push back against gender stereotyping. He has done work which opened up a lot of viewers to conversation about a wider acceptance about body types. One very notable show used as models step team members recruited from American sororities. So some of you may be aware of fashion and some of you may pay no attention to it. The runway models in fashion are almost exclusively very young and very thin, usually bored looking, maybe a little tired. These women are powerful and assertive. And so visually, this show was a huge departure from what fashion viewers would see at shows that they attend. I think that there's a whole interesting avenue that we're not going to go down this particular rabbit hole today. That's looking at these really boundary pushing creators and looking at how they do the balance of this kind of work with being able to have a successful commercial aspect to their work. And in many cases, you might need to find that balance in order for your more creative work to have the funding to be fully realized. Rick Owens, for example, regularly makes very wearable and highly covetable clothing. But for this session, we're not going to let that be our direction. I want to still focus really on where the creative is coming from. So I'll leave that to someone for a future conversation. Now we're going to look at the work of another fashion designer, Iris van Herpen. Iris van Herpen's work features really beautiful fabrications. They push the boundaries of the materials and the construction that she uses. She makes very beautiful clothes. They are worn often by performers, celebrities, on the red carpet. But her work clearly goes beyond just making commercial haute designer clothing. This is the same piece from different views. You can see what interests her. She says herself, her work is nature inspired. She's interested in organic forms and takes inspiration from patterns in nature, water. And there's a lot of exploration of using materials in new ways and pushing the limits of what these materials can do. These things are beautiful. And again, not necessarily what you would think of as, they're clearly not run-of-the-mill everyday clothing. Excuse me. Iris Herpen works with a lot of collaborators in her work. That's increased over time. Those collaborators are often outside of fashion. She works with architects, artists, and sound artists, and has a close relationship with some performers who use her clothing. Her collaborations incorporate elements from outside of fashion, pieces of art, pieces of architecture. She's worked with the MIT Media Lab and uses 3D printed elements and some very revolutionary 3D printing of soft materials in her work. There are 3D waves live painted and filmed and then transparently printed onto glass organza spheres. A lot of use of material that you don't associate with clothing. And there's a new exploration in each set of her looks. They look quite distinct, and yet at the same time, these pieces are clearly from the same designer. There's a distinct and recognizable point of view, and I think also a distinct and recognizable set of avenues that you can see she's interested in exploring. In that way, I think very similar to Rick Owens. There's the eye of themselves as a creator very clear in their work. You can see their creative point of view, and yet you see them pushing themselves and changing as they work. And these are just some shots of close-ups of the pieces of Iris van Herpen's clothing, which are just extraordinary in their detail. She also is very respectful of the process of haute couture, the handmade time it takes, attention to detail that allows a piece like this to be possible. There's some of these artists who do work with such a new eye in their mediums that initially when we look at their work, they don't look like anything we've ever seen. And over time, that work can actually redefine how we see and how these entire forms are seen. I'm going to look a little bit at the work of the architect Zaha Hadid. My quote from her, which I love, is she says, "I don't make nice little buildings." Her work is eye-catching. It's often known for the use of curved elements and a sense of movement. She takes what we know to be strong building materials and makes them appear to be completely fluid. And the look of her buildings radically transforms depending on the location of the viewer. Her former professor, the famed architect Rem Koolhaas, described her at her graduation as a planet in her own orbit. Her work originally was known through sketches and drawings, and it just didn't look like anything else that was around at the time. And there was a huge pushback that these designs were too avant-garde to be built and too impractical, impossible to be built. And in this instance, I think there's something that most people working in lighting design will recognize. In our field, a designer needs to be chosen or hired and the work funded in order to be able to create in this field. And again, the implications of that are probably a session on their own, that we need more than outside validation, we need buy-in, and we need someone to choose us in order to get the position to be able to do our creative work. And in Zaha Hadid's case, there was pushback hugely early in her career and many projects that were not able to be built. Nonetheless, she imagined buildings in wildly new forms, and then eventually her realized designs proved that they could be built, and probably only built with really the most recent decades worth of technology. While I don't think this is true of all of her work, some of the spaces that I've been in of her design were not necessarily comfortable for the user. They felt completely as though they were meant as her creative exploration of form and not much with the interest of the people using the space. And she has been described as being interested in the bigger picture and not the functional details. She's not afraid to push the technical end of construction to develop. These could not have been conventionally constructed buildings. So if they're made with a user in mind, it's not the everyday that she's ever been interested in. The buildings are complex, they're costly to construct. Not everyone liked her work, and it's a loss that she died young and we don't know where her work would have continued to go. But everybody noticed her work. And if one day we look at a skyline and we think nothing of buildings with curved details and unexpected flowing complex forms, when that becomes an expected and natural part of the skyline, a lot of that will have come from Zaha Hadid. I think having looked at these three creators working really outside what we do, it's interesting to look a little bit at some of the specific elements that we use in creatively working in lighting design. You know, continuing to think about the drive for creativity. I thought a lot working on this, what draws someone creatively towards the specifics of working in lighting? And also what's unique, special, what's different or important about this medium in terms of how we create? There are some creative elements which are specific and relevant to work in lighting. And so some, but by no means all of them, it might include abstraction, live performance, work created and performed for an audience, collaboration, kineticism, a creative work which inherently evolves and changes over time, and also the reliance on and use of technical equipment to produce the creative work. And so I think we'll just take some of these, and maybe in breaking them down and looking at them individually, we might find some interesting insights in how these elements come to play in lighting. Oop, I should have been there, but we will move on. Let's start by talking about abstraction. Lighting designers probably did not go through an intentional process where they decided to work in a form that's abstract. You know, I'm trying to picture someone considering what avenue or career to follow and thinking, yep, I definitely want to do work which only has abstract elements to work with. But it's so primary to what we do. It's such an abstract form. You know, if there's any exception, maybe it's conventional theater where you might be trying to recreate the sense of an actual environment, you know, light through the window in the afternoon. But for the most part, we are working with an abstract language. And in the process of their work, a lighting designer probably doesn't break down in their head how they're using these tools and elements of abstraction. But in using them, they're still at the very heart of what we do. These tools, color, shape, form, creating positive and negative spaces, play a part in every piece of lighting design. I'd like to look at this through some of the work of three American painters, all of whom are still working. All of them approach and use the element of abstraction in very intentional ways. Suzanne Frécon, she has said that her works speak for themselves. She has said, quote, "These are not pictures that you look at, they are paintings that you experience." Her work is so grounded in these fundamentals arrangements of color, form, and texture. They're characterized by asymmetrical forms that are yet balanced in very precise spatial and proportional relationships. She's worked throughout her career very specifically on the paint that she uses, mixing to get paints that are very matte, sometimes contrasting matte and shiny surfaces. This doesn't read so well in these shots, but is really important to the experience of her work. It's almost tactile. And the colors and surfaces appear to vary in density and reflectivity, and areas in the compositions often frequently shift between dark and light. As we look at these, I think it can be hard to determine foreground and background, or where she's seeing full space or empty space. And I think that that element of controlling positive and negative space or playing with it is very fundamental to lighting design. Frey Kahn insists that art should be a wordless experience, that paintings invite us into a plane beyond understanding. And another quote from her, a quote from a review of her work from Hypoallergenic. "We would do well to remember the power of color to influence the feeling and atmosphere of narrative content. It is not a negligible quality." So I think it's interesting to use at these works, which are so simple and on the surface, and yet are playing with so many ideas about visual creation. And in stripping back to these very elemental form, shape, color, we're looking at the real building blocks of abstract creative work. Now we're going to look at the work of the painter Richard Mayhew. I think most people who work in lighting would say certainly that they intend for their specific choices to have meaning, that they're intending to convey something through these choices that we make. Mayhew is known as a landscape painter, and these images would read to us as landscapes. We understand them as such, but not a landscape that we have seen literally. Mayhew himself refers to them as mindscapes. So not the facts of a landscape, but the spirit of a landscape. He was influenced by jazz. He was both Native American and Afro-American, and he came of age in the New York Abstract Expressionist movement, which was very identity and politically oriented. And he's often not mentioned in the movements he was part of because he doesn't use the more literal, narrative, political, and figurative elements of the other members of his very engaged movement. And just a quote from him, "My mindscapes are also about the healing of the long trauma that Black and Native communities have experienced collectively. What I do with landscapes is internalize my emotional interpretation of desire, hope, fear, and love. So instead of a landscape, it's a mindscape. Landscape has no space, no identity. It allows the painting to be about emotion." So Mayhew is using these tools of color and form, even with an understandable reference to something that we recognize, as a tool to convey emotion. And while these are clearly deeply personal works, there's also the resonance of emotion that's larger than just his own feelings, his identity, and seeing his work as a reflection of the experience and struggle of oppressed people. They're also just really gorgeous. Look at some paintings by the artist Anne Neely. Anne Neely's paintings, recent paintings particularly, respond to climate disasters and climate change. The paintings are fully abstract, but the emotional heft and the content is very strong. To quote the Anne Neely, "Although my work has always had a specific context, the act of painting most compels me. Paint leads me essentially." Reviews of her work have said, "The paintings are gorgeous, yet an ominous quality imbues many. Anne Neely's, in her work, referring really specifically to the degradation of ecology, but again, to quote her, "I'm a painter first, not a politician. But if in the process of creating these paintings, a story is revealed about concern for water, its peril or preciousness, or the impending disappearance of beauty in our blindness towards the environment, then I have been a vehicle for that message." Here again, Neely's using abstract elements of color, form, and shape, but here in the surface of a very specific message. So kinetic art, creative work which changes over time. Work with which inherently changes. There's no one set state. It is not static. Increasingly, this is true description of architectural and installation lighting, as well as performance lighting. Many installations are now kinetic in some aspect, if not fully programmable, maybe as simple as alternate settings for time of day in a restaurant. In these circumstances, each creative choice is not for a permanent state of work or even for a moment in time, but for how the elements got there and where they're going. It's not only a snapshot of a look, which is how so often we see this work documented, but the transition and the movement itself are the base of the creative work. The kinetic art movement, we are not going to explore today because I'm going to run out of time. But I think it was just worth touching on, and if this is interesting to anyone, it might be worth going off to look at. The kinetic art movement was primarily Latin American artists who worked together in Paris, not only dedicated to creating kinetic art itself. The work was largely a presaging of the experiential movement in art and elsewhere. The works required audience participation, or at the very minimum, a change of audience perspective, and they relied on that for the change in the state of the works themselves. So these artists primarily created objects and environments which were static until the viewer interacted with them, pushing through a walk-through sculpture and so on, therefore creating movement in the pieces, movement which could not have existed without the participation of the viewer. Another really interesting kinetic artist to look at is the sculptor Alexander Calder. His work has been described as a careful balance of control and letting go. And these kinetic objects change in their relationship to the environment and to the perspective of the viewer. And a quote from Calder, who I think after reading his quotes, I would have liked to know. He said, "I want to make things that are fun to look at, that have no propaganda value whatsoever." When Calder visited Mondrian's studio in Paris in 1930, he remarked about this visit, quote, "I was particularly impressed by some rectangles of color he had tacked on his wall in a pattern after nature. I told him I would like to make it oscillate, and he objected." So there's a playful element really evident in Alexander Calder's work, but it was not just fun that he was striving to express in his sculpture. There's beauty, movement, color, and maybe primarily balance. Calder's largest piece, Untitled, hangs in the National Gallery of Art's East Wing. And so in a due acknowledgement of our exposure and experiences, I grew up in DC, so I remember when this museum opened and this piece was first installed. These pieces of Calder's mobiles, they're made up of various size pieces and sometimes vary in color, but nonetheless, there is a great sense of balance. And the pieces are balanced physically as well, so well that they can appear to be completely static at times, and so well that a very small wind or other change gives them independent movement. They look effortless, but they're the product of intensely accurate engineering, engineering primarily carried out by Calder himself, and done so delicately that it's not what you think about when viewing them. The larger pieces move sometimes so slowly in their spaces that it's all but inevitable, all but unnoticeable. But upon re-entering a space where they're installed, they can appear completely different in form. The largest pieces in the largest spaces change the viewer's perception of the space itself. What is so interesting looking at these is that Calder so carefully designed the individual elements and the possibility of movement here, and then completely gave up control of these pieces to nature, to the moment. Once these pieces are hung and moving on their own, he is not the determinant of the forms in which they find themselves. And I think that's an amazing thing to think about creatively. This is the art of William Forsythe. It's a piece called Black Flags. William Forsythe is primarily a choreographer, but he has for some time now also made what he calls choreographic objects. They've included film, installation, and sculptures. This piece pairs mechanics and technology, the robotic arms with very soft structures, the flags, and is a pairing of the hard and the soft. And in the movement, there's a contrast between the predictability and repeatability of the machines and the fluidity of the fabric, plus an element of variability from air, which changes in these spaces. The two flags sometimes move in unison, and sometimes they move in counterpoint. This piece is reprogrammed each time it's installed in a new environment. So it's not a set, finished work of creation. Each showing's an opportunity for Forsythe to rethink some of these elements. I'm just going to let you hear the sound of it. You hear the sound of both elements as well. The grind of the machines, but also the much more organic snap of the fabric and the flags. And again, this is a piece which is so carefully and in a detailed way conceived, but again, can alter based on what's happening in the space that it's in. This is a piece by the artist Robert Irwin. He's recognized for pioneering approach to exploring notions of perception and space. These pictures are of an installation at the Chianti Foundation in Marfa, Texas, which opened in 2016. It took 17 years of preparation. The installation has an interplay of shadows, color, form, and space that unfold and change throughout the day. There's no distinction between architecture and art in this project. Again, one of the things that I guess keeps coming up in so many of the works we're looking at, where they cross boundaries between forms. Irwin himself calls his artistic approach conditional art. This site had been home to a long abandoned remnants of a 1919 army barrack and then a hospital. The floorboards and roof were rotted out, and the windowsills of the concrete shell hit exactly at eye level. And Irwin was very moved by how that framed the landscape due to this unusual height of the windowsill, just this sliver of land and an expansive sky. And they struggled for a long time to preserve the existing building, which they eventually had to abandon. And so this piece is not only the shape within the building, but the very building itself is built to Irwin's design, with the memory of the old echoed within it. The project's symmetrical, and the east and west wing have opposing themes of dark and light. The east wing features tinted windows and closely spaced black scrims, and the west wing, white scrims and very clear glass windows. And the connecting corridor has single scrims and thresholds. Light, shape, and shadow shift and change in this building through the day and into night, changing with the light throughout the year. A simple but meticulously detailed and conceived structure provides this evolving, shifting perception of relationships between light and dark. Nothing moves or changes within this installation, yet changing light is the very heart of the experience of seeing this piece. Hey, I'm just gonna stop for a second to say, I just wanna touch in on time. Have I run out? Should I do one more section?
You can keep going, Abby, that's okay.
Okay, I shall. So I just would like to look for a minute at some elements that have specifically to do with live performance. There's so many facets to this. You know, what is essential or unique about creative work for a live performance, as opposed to a more permanent medium? There's a specific wonder to a live performance. It's really fully experienced only by those in that place at that time, even if it's documented, even if it's more or less repeated the next night. It can never be revisited exactly as it was in that space at that time. And I am fascinated by how that might change how we think about these works creatively. I'm also curious about the dialogue between the creator and the audience that experience it. Thinking back to this retired painter in his basement, you know, this seems to be a medium that has a desire for a viewer for the work and opens up the question of how that influences the work itself. Maybe it's for approval or confirmation, but maybe also from a desperate need to connect. The driving force between the desire to do creative work is to connect. And that would make the engagement with the viewer a truly inherent element of the creative work. And then if you are creating for an audience, do you need to have empathy and understanding of the viewer and their point of view to make a work for them? Or can you simply create what you feel, what you're driven to explore, what you like, and assume the viewer will come to you in their experience of your creative choices? And then past that, is there a point where you start to build your work specifically to the expectations of this viewer? To push buttons you know are there because you know they're going to deliver the moment that you expect and they expect. That can be very satisfying. And then how much are their expectations that your work fit within an expected mold? Look like similar projects, but better and bigger, of course. Except for the very dedicated or the very lucky, we need supporters, clients, patrons, or buyers to dedicate your life to creative work. So how much does that change what you do in your work? I'm also interested in how much the feedback drives people doing creative work. Do we need an audience and feedback and response to keep developing and extending our creativity? If we made this work and got nothing back, what do we take to the next piece of work that we make? It's built out of personal development and the lessons in the last work, but is there a value to the opinion of a second eye, a critic, an audience response? I think even more static, older, conventional creative work, such as a classic painting, is having a dialogue with the viewer. And as modern day creators, is our awareness of this much more direct or faster? Does our media connected, fast responding environment change that? I got thinking about this and I got very interested in work which was really specifically framed for the viewpoint of the observer. And we'll look first at a piece by the artist Laurie Anderson. I saw this piece in a group exhibit. So I've been walking through a museum and it was a video exhibit. So there were a lot of pieces of video. Some were great, some were just okay. And they're mostly at head height, or they're on a wall, they're a certain size. And then I saw this very small chair. It's 20 centimeters tall, 3 foot 13 inches. This little chair down on the floor. And the piece is a clay mold of Anderson sitting in an armchair, and a video of Anderson is projected onto the statue. So by choosing to scale the piece in this way, she immediately made the viewer have to adjust to view the piece in the context of this group installation, but probably anywhere that you saw it. And that level of making me respond to the piece immediately required my involvement. I had to be involved in looking at the piece. She's telling a story about a session with her psychiatrist, and partway through she comes to the conclusion that she and the psychiatrist see things, literally and figuratively, from different angles. So the very form of the piece is elemental to the narrative. And that's the little clay statue. And looking again in this conversation to another video artist, the artist Pipolati Rist. A quote from her: "In the Western world, color is underestimated. Color is borderless, it's dangerous, it's emotional, like music." This first piece, you might recognize it not from Pipolati Rist's work, but from the homage video made by Beyonce. It was one of the earlier works by Pipolati Rist, and was a set of works she made that were single camera pieces, basically a single piece of video art, known similar to what we would recognize as a piece of film. And after that, her pieces become really different. And one interesting aspect of her work is how inherently and intimately she's making her work fully considering the audience's point of view and how they will experience it, and often controlling that. You see this single camera video of Rist, which is called Selfless in the Bath of Lava. And looking at these still images, you might expect it to be another single piece of video, but that is not how this piece exists. It's displayed always embedded under the floor, and the piece is tiny. So the viewer must first adjust to a position which is not the one in which they usually view art. And then they have to adjust to the scale, coming in close enough to see they're being fully drawn into the piece. They're not just browsing through a gallery. And in that very gesture of bending down, engaging, they've connected to the piece. Even more than the Laurie Anderson piece, this piece demands the involvement of the viewer. Other pieces of her work have video inside a box where the viewer must stick their head inside the box to see the piece. Some of her installations have pieces where the viewer lays on beanbags or other pads on the floor. One was shown in the very large atrium space at MoMA, which had been a notoriously hard space to use effectively. And there are interviews where Rist talks about how exhibit viewers use their time and how they experience time. If they're going to take the time to come and view, she wants them to be engaged and rewarded. And one of the pieces of the experience of being at one of these installations is that it defies your expectation of how time usually moves looking at a piece of art. There's gradual coming and going of other viewers. They move around you, laying or sitting down. They watch for different lengths of time. They move on and are replaced. And that flow of other people watching and reacting becomes a part of the experience of the piece. You know, I think this is where the world's maybe caught up to now. There's so much video, so much more experiential art, and I think there's a push to move towards this work which changes over time and which inherently involves the viewer or engages the viewer in different ways. And I think maybe we should stop it there. How are we? Should we? Should we call a halt and maybe take some questions?
Abby, we did have a few questions, but if you want to continue through the rest of your presentation, that's fine as well.
Okay, I want to do one more section. I want to talk
Yeah.
collaboration a little bit. I'm sorry, it was very hard to gauge without, I've never done this without people in the room, how fast it would go. I do normally try to time myself. Um, I think one of the other things that's really interesting to me about lighting design is what a collaborative world we end up working in. And I guess the voice in the back of my head always said, if you want to make every choice by yourself, you could go to your room and paint. It speaks to one of the areas in our work where there's skill sets that really help you to be able to navigate that successfully and enjoy working in these fields. And there's so many forms of collaboration between the disciplines, other creators that are a piece of the project, between the client, the audience, and from your initial creative inspiration, there can be a lot of movement in response to these external factors to where a project ends up. And I think, again, there could be a whole nother look at what are the requirements and options for working successfully within those strictures, when to advocate for your view, when to adapt for a collaborator's view. But what I want to actually talk about today is collaboration within a team. Because I think we think first of collaboration between the disciplines, but not as immediately about collaboration between our own team members. In lighting, it is a rare and small project where a designer touches alone every element going into the design. It's not someone alone in their studio. So many of the other people working to realize the lighting design are critical and furthermore, huge contributors to the outcome. I mean, I think we think first of the programmers who certainly are intrinsic to the process, but it's not least to look at MEs, gaffers, every member of the crew who can hugely influence how a piece comes out. And everyone knows and appreciates this. We all fight to get the people we want on our projects. We think about casting the right people for the project style. But maybe we don't always think of it as directly as this piece of the creative process itself, very just inherent to our creative work. Gemini GEL was a very, very unusual, still exists, a very unusual printmaking house. So printmaking for art pieces is very different from like taking something to your local corner shop. There's an accuracy of color, specificity of surfaces and paper, some unique to each project. And the people who do this work are skilled artisans and artists in their own right. Gemini GEL, still operating, is amongst those entities still a very unique entity. It's where artisans and the most technically advanced printmakers work directly with artists to take their art and the capabilities of printmaking to new levels. The printmakers behind the studio set the parameters of how they wanted to work. The facilities could be open only to invited artists, and the artists would work directly with the process alongside the printers. Each work would be conceived exclusively for the publishing and editions, strictly limited, each signed and numbered by the artists and identified by a Gemini stamp, signifying authenticity of each print or multiple. In other words, this shop is not printing up a reproduction of something that already existed somewhere else. Only original work inherently produced together with the artists would be done in their shop. And their contribution would be inherently noticed as contributors to the art. And from its beginning, this workshop championed technical experimentation, and that allowed artists to make groundbreaking work. In its second year, Gemini made history by printing Robert Rauschenberg print booster, which was the largest hand-pulled lithograph ever made at the time. And this monumental size shifted the role of printmaking in art, allowing it to rival the scale and potency of painting. And the workshop earned its reputation for fostering great artistic achievement through this spirit of collaboration and embrace of innovation. The artists who were known for their work there include Robert Rauschenberg, Klaus Oldenburg, Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, Dorothea Rockburn, and Richard Serra. Richard Serra, who we just saw in the previous slide, and these are his prints, he's known for monumental sculptures, but you can see the echo of their forms in these print works. He was a member of the process art movement, where the end product is not the principal focus. The process of the making is one of the most relevant aspects, possibly the most important. And the gathering, sorting, patterning, and initiation of actions and proceedings are part of the work itself. And process artists saw work as pure human expression, that the process of creating can be a piece of art within itself. This is a piece by Jasper Johns, also more interested in the process of art making than the finished piece. And for this reason, he was always interested in printmaking and its collaborative aspects. He did work in lithography, etching, and screen printing at Gemini that changed many aspects of how printmaking was done. This is the artist Claes Oldenburg. Gemini, in working with these artists, pushed well past the classic confines of printing, moving printing capabilities into making 3D options. In this edition of multiples that Gemini created for Oldenburg, called the Airflow, it completes the process of making a graphic conception into actuality. In a sense, it's a three-dimensional drawing. You can see here, in our first shot, we saw Oldenburg drawing the piece. Then you see it being made into a 3D mold, which you see him holding here. And the final piece has his original blueprint at the base with the translucent mold on front. So the piece is involved with reflections, transparency, tactile sense, scale, depth, and mass. And has truly taken printmaking past what we would initially think of it to be. I think for me, my takeaway from this section is there's so many more avenues for us to really value those who are working with creatively and let that change what is possible for us to do. I think we all do that without stopping to think about it, but a worthy thing to think about in what we do. I hope that this has been interesting and not too esoteric or strange for everyone. And I thank you so much for joining me and letting me do this little exploration of ideas.
Great. We do have some questions if you have time, Abby.
I would love to do some questions.
Perfect. The first question is, how can one free themselves from comparing their own creativity to that of others?
It's a really good question. I don't, like so many of the issues here, I don't know that the same answer is going to be true for everybody. I think people work in different ways and find their motivation in different ways. But maybe even in just voicing this and thinking about it and talking about it, it can bring awareness of that. It might be as simple as saying, you catch yourself doing that. And as well as hearing in your head the voice of what you think someone else might do or might be thinking, you remember to turn back to your own.
Great. The next question is, as a lighting designer, how do you play with form and shape?
There's so many ways. And again, I guess answering for me personally, that's how I understand the question. In the work I did, particularly in concert lighting, I've often been interested in whether we confine the space or expand the space. I'll just use as an example some of the work I did for the band The Cure. The first work that I did for them, we were really conscious of the fact that it was a kind of more intimate, quieter record, and we, not exclusively, but in large form, turned the lighting inward towards the musicians themselves and kept it contained to the space of the performance area. And in a later show that we did, we were really looking to be expansive. And in that show, we try to take beam and shape and space and extend it far, far beyond where the physical limitations of the stage are. So sometimes maybe just in the fact of remembering that it's a tool that you have is, lets you do some fun things that a road you might not go down otherwise.
Perfect. The next question is, Can you tell us an example of when you think you pushed the boundaries in one of your own designs?
Ooh, that's hard. Speaking of not comparing myself to these other awesome artists that we've worked with, I'm gonna have to think about that one. I might have to come back to that one.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
This is why I like questions ahead, because I'm not that fast on my feet about them. I feel like any answer I give is going to sound a little bit snobby.
So we have two more, it looks like. So the next one is, how do you like to think of color and make your own color choices?
Um, You know, there is such a good, interesting avenue of exploration around color. I am really fascinated in the science of how people perceive color. It seems the more and more anyone studies it, the more we know that that not everyone sees color the same way. There's studies that show that women have vastly greater numbers of color receptor rods than men, which might imply that there is a deeper variation of shade of color perceptible to some people than others. We also don't really know that we're seeing the same thing when we look at color. You know, we've all learned to call the color on the screen yellow, but it doesn't mean that what you're looking at looks to you the way it does to me. There's no objective way I know of for anyone to figure that out. I think when you go to look at lighting designers' work, you start to see that pretty fast. I feel like you see real differences in people's approach to color, use of color, in how they build their palettes. I hope for me that those palettes are crafted specifically out of the heart of what I think is important about a work, and that they change from piece to piece, depending on what world we're living in, what we're trying to evoke, what the base of mood or story in that piece is. So maybe just for me to keep exploring it and looking at it, trying to look at it differently every time. I'll just say on a lighter note that I love green, which no one really does any justice to, and it's very underused. So a soft spot for green.
Great. The next question is, how do you express and or free yourself in an environment that appears to stifle your creativity?
Well, this is a tough one. And I think it's something we all grapple with. I'll say, you know, you can look at someone else's body of work and think, oh my gosh, they are so lucky. They got these great opportunities. They did really great projects with cool people and good budgets and great opportunity to be creative. And probably you're only looking at a little piece of what's true for them. They have probably had a lot of projects they didn't feel that way about. There may have been things that you would never know on the projects that they are on. I think there are projects where you just feel so lucky. You feel like everything came together to support doing creative work the way you'd most like to. And then there's projects where maybe that's not what it's about. I get great enjoyment from some projects I do that are maybe not trying to be art. They're a corporate project, or I do some, I mean, in the before times, who knows what we do now. But I have been lucky to do some really fun projects for YouTube where they just have performers that are outside the box, and that creative team is really fun. And there's a joy in that project out of the experience. And I think for me, I look at each project. Some are very restrictive. Some are may initially appear to not be something that speaks to you personally, but you can, at least for me, I can find a piece in that project where I think there's an opportunity to do something good. And by finding that piece and taking joy in that piece, there's a way to find something good about the work that you do. Some of it's going to knock it out of the park and be the experience of your lifetime. And some are going to be really nice and good. And that's fine too.
Perfect. So we have one more. Is there such a thing as a creative mistake?
Yeah, I'm sure we all have regrets. That is an excellent question. But I mean, on the other hand, no, because in the purest sense, it's a learning opportunity. um, I'm sure that we all have moments that we wish weren't, indelibly out there on the record, that maybe our learning opportunity wasn't so public. Um, so I'll just go back to, I taught for 2 years at Carnegie Mellon University in the drama department. And that is an opportunity to see a lot of really talented people doing early pieces of work where there's still a lot of learning going on, because you do gain knowledge from your experience over time. There's a freshness point of view that you bring when you're starting, and you want to try not to lose that, but you also are going to just widen what you know as you go along. And so it's fascinating to watch a bunch of really talented people work through those early pieces. And there was a period when I was there where there was sort of a feeling that everything that went on one of the stages at this university should be good. And I really thought that was not a good choice for a learning experience, because I think the thing that we're missing if we don't talk about it is risk-taking. And if someone asked where did I think I had pushed a boundary, if you are not putting yourself out there with some element of risk-taking, you're probably not moving forward, and you're probably not going to push a boundary. And risk-taking is a risk. It's going to occasionally probably not go the way you wished. And so, you should gauge that carefully. A really big, important professional job might not be where you want, gauge where the risk is appropriate. But I think being willing to accept that there might be a mistake is the only way you try something you don't already know. The only way to do something new.
Great. Well, that looks like all the questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Abby, thank you so much for your time. This was a great presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who watched.
Bye, everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Abby. That was wonderful.